So I had just left active duty. I had joined a Marine Reserve unit in Manhattan, MTU 17, Marine Training Unit 17. I remember walking to work and thinking, what a perfect day, you know. I got to my office and my assistant at one point came in and said, hey, I just heard a plane hit the World Trade Center. And I'm a pilot, you know, I have my pilot's license, and I thought, well, that's interesting. And then I heard big screaming from her office. And I said, what happened? What happened? What happened? And she said, another plane just flew into the other World Trade Center. And I remember thinking, what? That doesn't add up at all. And immediately I was like, I think we're under attack, which sounded crazy to say. I got a call from my commanding officer and said, hey, listen, our unit has been activated. So I thought, wow, that was fast. But, you know, it made sense because we were the only reserve unit in Manhattan. And so I said, what does that mean? He says, well, put on your boots and utes. Did what he said. I put it on. Next morning, reported to ground zero. And we're going to start moving rubble by hand. Because at the time, it was search and rescue. Because we still thought there could be hundreds, maybe thousands of people trapped in this rubble. There were 6 stories of rubble.
You are about to embark upon the Great Crusade.
To meet this mounting aggression.
And make no mistake about it, good will prevail.
So I had just left active duty, not more than 9 or 10 months prior to 9/11 happening. I had joined a Marine Reserve unit in Manhattan, MTU 17, Marine Training Unit 17. I had a day job, and at night I was pursuing comedy. And I was staying in the reserves because I love the Marine Corps, and I wanted to stay connected, and I wanted to still be a part of it. So, but I also wanted to be a comedian and actor, and I needed to stay in New York to make that happen. So when they got me new orders on active duty, they wanted me to go to Fort Meade and teach journalism or something, and I was like, yeah. So I said, you know what, I'm going to go ahead and get out of active duty and join the reserves and stay in Manhattan and keep pursuing comedy and acting. And then within 9 months of that happening, 9/11 happened. And we were attacked, and everybody remembers that day. If you were an adult and an American, you'll never forget that day. Just like the generation before us will never forget Pearl Harbor, you know, the shock and the surprise. And we had so much, you know, obviously times have changed, so we have such graphic video and such recording of it that it affected everybody deeply. And I was obviously in Manhattan on 9/11. It was gorgeous, and I remember walking to work and thinking, what a perfect day, you know, it was wonderful. And got to my office, and my assistant at one point came in and said, hey, I just heard a plane hit the World Trade Center. And I'm a pilot, you know, I have my pilot's license, and I thought, well, that's interesting, you know, and I kind of was behind on work, so I went back to work. And then I started thinking about it. I was like, well, how did that happen? Because, you know, this is a perfect day, you know. So I jumped up and I said, well, hey, tell me what happened. And she was like, I don't know. It's all happening right now. And so we turned on the television and we found the coverage, and you could see smoke coming out of the World Trade Center. And I remember thinking, well, that looks too big to be like a little Cessna or a little private plane to make that much, you know, smoke. And we were debating it and talking about what it could be, and you know, and that just doesn't seem possible on a day like today for a commercial pilot. So, you know, all this is happening, and nobody knows anything yet. Like, remember that the phone lines weren't bursting out. Nothing had really unfolded. We were still waiting for the shoe to drop, I guess. And I called my wife at the time, and she was working closer to downtown. I worked on 42nd and Park Avenue, and she worked down probably around 30th and 7th Avenue. So she was down in the Garment District, a little closer. And she had big windows on her facing south. And she said she was watching it live. And I said, are you seeing this? And we were talking. And then I heard big screaming from her office. And I said, what happened? What happened? What happened? And she said, another plane just flew into the other World Trade Center. And I remember thinking, what? That doesn't add up at all. And immediately I was like, I think we're under attack, which sounded crazy to say, but you can't dispute it. Something's going on. So I said, I think we're under attack. I ran back out to my office. they were all watching in shock because it happened live. So I had my ex on the phone and I said, "Stay there, I'm coming to get you." So I left my office and ran down to where she was. And I remember when I got out on the streets, it was a very surreal moment because I think the trains had stopped at that point. And I just remember everybody was on the surface. So the sidewalks were packed, but the traffic wasn't moving. I mean, the hustle and bustle of New York City, it's legendary. It's phenomenal. But for whatever reason, you had all these people on the surface. Nobody was underground. Everybody was on the surface. The traffic had stopped, but there were no horns. There was no talking. And it was just this very eerie quiet. And I remember I was going down Fifth Avenue. I'd cut over from Park to Fifth, and I was headed down Fifth to get over to 7th, and 30th or whatever. And I remember going down Park, and you could see smoke all the way downtown. You could see it, and there was a state of shock. It was this, this is happening, but no one knows what it is yet. Nobody knows what it means. Nobody knows what's next. It's a very confusing and shocking time, obviously. That's what happens in a surprise attack. So I remember getting down to my wife at the time. I remember getting down to her office, getting her, and then we walked back to our apartment, which was up like 44th and Lexington. So we got back up there, and then we just did what everybody else did, hunkered down in front of our television and tried to figure out what was happening. And we watched like everybody else in horror as the towers fell and people were running for their lives. And this was happening just, less than a mile away from us. In a place that we were very familiar with. My wife at the time, the night I proposed to her, I took her to Windows on the World, which is the restaurant on top of the World Trade Center, and we had gone there a couple times for one or two of our anniversaries, and so we were very familiar with the whole downtown area, and we knew people up there in the World Trade Center. So we were very concerned.
For those who serve, for those whose sacrifice will never end, the Gary Sinise Foundation shows its gratitude through entertainment, outreach, and life-changing support. To learn more, visit GarySiniseFoundation.org.
That night of September 11th, pretty much that afternoon, evening, I got a call from my commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Steve Brozak, called and said, "Hey, listen, our unit has been activated." So I thought, wow, that was fast, but it made sense because we were the only Marine unit, we were the only reserve unit in Manhattan, and all the bridges and tunnels were closed, and they didn't know what they were dealing with. Everybody was still trying to figure a lot of things out. There were a lot of questions, a ton more questions than there were answers at that time. And so I said, what does that mean? He says, well, put on your boots and utes, utilities and boots, and that means for a lot of your cami uniform, camouflage. And so I did what he said. I put it on. Next morning, reported to Ground Zero, One Police Plaza, which is very close to Ground Zero, and we formed up. And they said, okay, well, nobody knew what was going on, but it was like, well, it's search and rescue, so let's go find a place. And we're going to start moving rubble by hand, because at the time it was search and rescue, because we still thought there could be hundreds, maybe thousands of people trapped in this rubble. There were 6 stories of rubble. So the towers collapse, and when they collapsed, they gutted other buildings. They smashed out foundations of other buildings. They smashed out windows of all the surrounding buildings. So those had collapsed into 6 stories of rubble and twisted metal and iron and pulverized concrete, which that pulverized concrete was kind of a moon dust. I'll never forget it. You step on it and it was these clouds and it was everywhere. I mean, it was a huge radius, and papers, like just everywhere, paper everywhere for blocks in every direction. Because, when it came down, it just compressed it all out and pushed it out. So you got 6 stories of rubble. You got this powder, which a couple days later it rained, and then that turned into a paste. And you had burnout cars and all these fire trucks that were burnt out, but there were skeletons of the trucks and skeletons of cars, and it was very surreal. When you walked downtown, it was surreal. That's the only way I could describe it, because it looked like a movie. It felt like it smelled, that smell of burning whatever it was, metal, concrete, pulverized concrete, that wet, pasty concrete. It's a very distinct smell. And so our unit, we went down to one of the corners of the towers. I don't know which tower it was. Tower 1 maybe? It was the one furthest south. And there was a Burger King across the street, kind of, and the windows had been blown out, and all those businesses were just devastated. But the Burger King, I just remember that's where we staged our gear. That's where we put our backpacks and canteens and whatever. And we would stage our gear there, and then we literally just formed a bucket brigade all the way up this hill, like ants going up a hill of this rubble. And then we were handing buckets up and buckets down, and just moving the rubble off the pile and down out to the outskirts of the blocks away, because you couldn't bring any heavy equipment into the area because we were afraid of cave-ins. And again, we thought it was search and rescue, so we're thinking there's bodies under here. So
you just like pick up sticks almost.
Yeah, you're picking up chunks of rocks and putting it in buckets, and you're sending them up and down, up and down. And from the 12th until the 18th, I think we worked 12 hours on, 12 hours off, 12 hours on, 12 hours off, 12 hours on, 12 hours off. And they gave us a little, eventually like day 2 or 3, they gave us a little surgical mask, because that moon dust was all over the place, right? And so we had the little surgical mask on. It wasn't much. It was literally just a little paper. I think I had more protection than COVID. But we had those eventually. Nobody liked them because it was harder. It was so hard to work, trying to breathe through that thing. And then our unit stayed there until the 18th. And then after the 18th, the word came down that, it was no longer search and rescue, that it was more search and recovery. And so they started bringing in heavier equipment and started moving things with bucket loaders, and they started making better progress. And then we were pulled off the rubble piles at that point, and they left it to the firefighters and more to the first responders. And our orders were from the September 12th to the September 30th. So, and then from the 18th or whatever, I went over to One Police Plaza and then just tried to help coordinate civilian military efforts, whatever that means, equipment, cadaver dogs, whatever was coming in from the military. I would liaison with the NYPD and try to work with them. I was a captain at the time. I just remember, like everybody, wanting to do something, feeling as every day that ticked off, you got more and more upset, more and more angry. You couldn't believe this happened. That first couple days, I remember F-16s flying around Manhattan very low. And, it was that shocking moment of, oh my gosh, I never thought I'd ever see a day when I'd have to have F-16s flying cover in New York City. It just seemed impossible. And if you remember back, everybody was hurting, everybody was angry. It was a sucker punch, and everybody couldn't get their head wrapped around it. They couldn't understand the evil. They were searching for answers. They didn't know what the answers were. A lot of people, when they're in shock, they can't process. It's natural. That's fine. And people wanted to help. I remember so many times in New York, the people in New York were so great. They wanted to help in any way they could. They were bringing clothes and food and waters and, down to as close as they could get to ground zero, and just staging it right there so that the first responders and anybody down there could actually just walk out to where the boundaries were and grab water and grab, at night if they needed a jacket or whatever, they could grab those things, and people were donating blood, and they needed to do something. And I was a 31-year-old captain in the Marine Corps. I had a pretty high security clearance. I knew they were going to need people. I knew what this meant. This is not something that you just, on that scale, you just don't bat your eyes at and walk away from. This is going to be, we're getting involved now. I called my CO, and I just said, listen, I know I've got a green badge. which is a TS, top secret, with a SCIF clearance. So I'm like, they're going to probably need me, or they're going to want me, especially for my job at the time, which was public affairs. So I said, put me back in if you can, and he called Central Command down in Tampa and said, hey, I got a young captain up here. He's got a green badge, and he wants to get back in. And November 10th, Marine Corps birthday, I got my orders to go back to active duty down at Central Command. I rented a car in New York, and I drove, because I didn't have a car at the time, and I drove down to Camp Lejeune, and I had to in-process back into active duty. And then from there, my parents met me in Camp Lejeune. They were in Kansas. They drove out from Kansas and met me in Lejeune. I turned the rental car back in. They gave me their car, and then I drove their car down to Tampa, and they flew back home. And that way I had a car. Got to Tampa on the 17th of November, checked into the public affairs office there in CENTCOM. Got briefed up on what was going on, what we were doing, just kind of got brought up to speed. Again, I was just a young captain, so. And then the colonel came to me and said, all right, don't unpack. You're going to Afghanistan. So I said, okay. And I was on a plane, I think the 30th of November, and headed over to Uzbekistan, to K2, landed there, spent a couple days there, tried to get into Afghanistan a couple times, tried to go over the mountains in a Chinook 47, and that was a harrowing experience. We couldn't make it over the mountains. We were flying at night. Snow's coming in through the gunner port, so you got snow in the fuselage, and it's the roughest ride I ever had in my whole life. And so we had to turn back halfway, and that was the longest night. So we didn't make it in that night, but I did kiss the ground when I got back to Uzbekistan. And then a couple days later, I got into Mazar-e-Sharif and joined up with a unit there, an Army unit, and started working with them in a public affairs and civil affairs capacity, and stayed with them till early February, and then they had stabilized their mission a lot. We had started doing more operations in the South, and so CENTCOM called me back. I went back, and I got back just in time for Operation Anaconda, which I worked at CENTCOM from the Joint Operations Center out of the JOC, and did that, and then ended up going back to Afghanistan in the summer of 2002 for just a couple months, two maybe 3 months tops, and then came back, and my year was up, and then I went back to New York, and stood by because they were gearing up for Iraq, and I didn't know if I was going to be involved in that or not. And then a year after that, I got on Saturday Night Live. And then, things started happening on the entertainment front. But that's kind of the story as I remember it from 9/11.
Sure. There's one story when you were working on the rubble pile where you were almost seriously injured with your leg.
Well, so when because the buildings were all unstable around us, like even a day or two after the 9/11, you had a whole other building collapse, like, World Trade Tower 6 or something. There was another whole building that collapsed. And there was another building that the Brooks Brothers store was in. I remember the Brooks Brothers was down low, but it was an office building up top, but it looked like Godzilla had just clawed out the front of those buildings because there was just this gash missing. So buildings were unstable. So with the winds, everybody just didn't know what we were dealing with. Another building could fall, it could collapse, and we were working against the clock because, again, we thought there were survivors. So we had to be down there. We couldn't just leave it. And so they had an air raid siren, one of those old World War II, and when that sounded, our job was to get out of there. get out, because they were afraid of something, a cave-in, a collapse, something. So that was the only instruction we had, was just get out. If you hear that, exit, get away from ground zero. So yeah, I remember I was down closer. I wasn't way up high. I was down closer to the base of the pile, and they fired up the alarm. So we all start, anytime you start moving quickly, it can turn into a rout very quickly. It can turn into everybody's just running because they don't know, it's a panic thing. Why are we running? Why are we running? And then everybody just takes off running. And I came running around the corner, and they had a generator with one of those big lights on top of it for night work. And it was set up around this in this alleyway, and so naturally everybody's like ants trying to find their way out. And so I came around the corner and ran into this generator where the trailer hitch extended out, and it was right about shin level. And I remember I hit it, and no problem, I thought, okay, I'll just get. But the body wave behind me, people just kept stacking up on me, and I couldn't necessarily get my legs out. And I could feel the pressure, and I thought, oh God, I'm going over, but my legs aren't. So I thought, I'm going to break my legs here. So I remember I had to use my old low post skills, give them the old Charles Barkley, and just drive my butt back into everybody. And I did. I got enough that I could get a little room for myself and get up on top of it. And then I just pointed it out to everybody so as people didn't stack up, keep stacking up or tripping over it. And I don't think anything happened. They sounded the safe to go back, so we all went back. But just, those moments, you just didn't know what was going to happen next. And so there was a tremendous amount of anxiety, and sadness. Anxiety, sadness, hurt, tremendous emotions. I was 31 at the time, and, I heard the story about all those traders at Cantor Fitzgerald, and, these guys are my age, and the guys that led the revolt on Flight 93, that guy was my age. I remember the name of the lead guy. Do you remember?
Todd Beamer.
Beamer. He was my age. He was my exact age. And I remember thinking, that could have been me. It could have been me, And so everybody was hurting. Everybody was sad. It's a tough time.